Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 14th episode of the Broadcast Club. I am your host this episode, Nakanashi.
I am Ange.
And I'm Ralana Tricolor.
Our topic this episode is visual novel endings. And to talk about this with us today, we have community member CTom42.
Hey there, I'm CTom42. You might know me as the guy who comments on every Umineko post on the subreddit.
Yeah, you sure do. How long have you been reading visual novels, CTom?
Probably 7 years now, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a little longer.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm glad to have you on here to talk about this with us. It's something that we want to have people who've read a lot of stuff, and because there's a lot of things to talk about endings. So to start off, let's just talk about, what are we actually talking about when we say endings in visual novels? How important are they to the overall enjoyment of reading any individual visual novel?
I mean, there's the super obvious definitions, like when you finish and there's nothing left to read. I mean, there's the obvious one, but I think there's some more depth to it than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, visual novels in particular, you've got, your kinetic novels with only a single ending. You've got stuff with character routes and then a true ending. You've got stuff that just has, various endings and there is no true ending. So it's a lot less clear cut in this medium than a lot of others what an ending really means.
Yeah, it's really unique in that way compared to other story-driven media. Like, obviously, you can have the same kind of thing happening in games. Like, you can have lots of different endings in games, but a lot of times games are more focused on gameplay and story might be secondary, though that's not always the case. But like anime or manga or light novels, the other things that kind of this type of community consumes, it's an ending. You get one rather than VNs, which could have, depending on if you count bad endings, in several tens of endings.
And there's definitely a tradition of this kind of thing in other media as well, just I think not nearly as common. Like you have the old school choose your own adventure books, or more recently Netflix putting out Bandersnatch, which was effectively a choose your own adventure movie. But yeah, I think this is definitely much more specific to games and VNs in particular.
Do you think it's better for the medium that we can explore different possibilities like that? I mean, personally, I do. Personally, I think that's kind of one of the draws of some visual novels is being able, instead of looking at a story start to finish, where you have, this is everything that happens and we're done, being able to say, well, what if this happened instead? And you can actually see that.
I think the flexibility allows for a lot of different types of stories to be told, but I also think there are some downsides to that flexibility. I think certain stories are more suited to having a singular ending, and a lot of visual novels might feel forced to toss in some extra endings for characters and stuff like that where they don't need them. So I think when it's done well and it's intended to be done that way and the story supports it, it is fantastic. But the fact that it's sort of a mainstay of the medium to have multiple endings sometimes can stifle things.
Yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword. Sometimes, yeah, like you say, but if you're in any kind of story and there's like, well, we have to, big thing with Japanese productions is you have to have time for all of the heroines that might appear in it, even if one of them is, we talked about it way back in an episode about true routes. But you have the story you want to tell, but then you tell all these other ones, and those ones really might not be as good as the main story. And they sometimes feel like it's just there to pad things out rather than to really tell a story that wanted to be told.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, calling back to the kinetic versus choices topic we had, as you mentioned there, like, you kind of have to have choices involved to have multiple endings. Like, I don't know how you would do that any other way, right? So, yeah, I think that it's heavily tied to that topic in terms of, like, if you're just doing it to have multiple heroines, like, yeah, sure, you can have it be fine. But I think, having multiple endings is at its most interesting when the multiple endings become part of the story and, like, an intentional design decision about the game.
Another thing that is also double-edged sword in a way is in certain routes, especially ones that focus on like one specific character, one or two characters will get a lot of the character development. But if it's either just if that character development is only in that route, and especially if it's a story-based visual novel, there's a chance that character development will kind of be null and void within the other routes. So in a way, it's good that you get to see a side that you can see a side of the character that, might not be able to be covered in the main story. But then at the same time, it's kind of like, well, it feels like a waste to have developed this character if it's not like what the author wanted to be the main heroine or character or whatever. And then even with just stuff like character routes and VNs like in Moege or Karages that don't really have a true ending, like it's kind of that feeling of, oh, I romanced this character and then she might have had like a problem that only the protagonist's intervention could have helped with, but by going for another girl, it's like, well, she's never going to be developed in that same universe, so it's kind of a feels bad kind of thing.
To build off what you were saying there a little bit, with the character development, I can think of at least one visual novel where the branches occur before the end of the common route, and it suffers very, very much from the main character getting character development that doesn't exist in these other branches and these other endings. So you end up with these very different versions of the main character, and then when you finally get back to the true ending, you almost don't recognize him because it's this version of him that you haven't seen since the common route, and it's very bizarre.
And I see people talk about this kind of thing with like Katawa Shoujo on the subreddit too, with like, oh, I finished this one route, and because of all this character development that happened when I got to the ending, I didn't want to go back and play other ones because I felt bad for the character that I'm leaving behind.
Mm-hmm.
I almost feel like if you want to go those multiple endings, you either need to have, especially with the main character who's going to be prominent in all of them, you either need to have him not develop in those endings, which I think is bad. You need to have him get the same development but from different causes, or you need to have him have radically different development in every ending, and that be an intentional part of the story, is look how different he turns out because of these different choices.
And that is why I think Fate Stay Night is such a good visual novel, is because definitely they decide to explore one character and how he reacts differently to different things, and so you see this different development and get these different endings that I think are all pretty satisfying, even though there's not like a true ending of the Fate VN. Like it's all kind of parallel endings that are all canonically true. And I think that's like one of the better examples of how you would do that and still have quality endings, as opposed to just saying, oh, well, there's a different route because different girl and therefore different ending.
One advantage of multiple endings that we haven't discussed yet is that one of the endings can be bad and the other ones can still be good. So you don't have all your eggs in one basket, which is something other mediums don't have. Because I can think of a lot of VNs where it's like, the true end's trash, but the character ends are good, or vice versa, or this one character end is terrible. And for a lot of people, while the endings aren't the end-all be-all, there's the entire breadth of the work to give you your overall opinion on it. The endings are your lasting impression. They're the last thing you get. So having multiple of them gives you more chances for you to have a favorable opinion of the work overall.
So
I'm trying to think about how to respond to that.
Yeah, well, go ahead.
Sure. I was just going to say that I think that while that's definitely the case, I really do feel like, people have a limited amount of energy they can put into a work, and I'd rather really have someone put their best effort into one good ending, or at least to getting the point across, because the thing about the ending is, as you said, is it's the moment of closure you have with the VN. You finish it, that's the last thing you can remember about your experience there, and I think really having a strong ending, giving that sort of closure or having this sort of resolution is it's really going to make a big difference on the impact that you're going to when you think back on that VN in the future, the thing that's going to stand out most strongly probably is that ending.
I definitely agree with that. I wasn't trying to imply that it allows people to be lazy. I think it allows them to try other more unusual things with some of the endings. Sure. Try something that might not be well received. That I've seen that a few times where it's something that if this was the only ending, they wouldn't have gone for it. And
that's a fair point.
Those will work for some people, they won't work for other people. But even when there is a shitty, lazy ending, at least some of the other endings can be good, and that could save your overall opinion. They shouldn't do that intentionally. They should try to make every ending as good as possible.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right on that, because it does afford the opportunity to be more adventurous maybe in what you want to tell. You don't necessarily have to I mean, I personally don't mind endings where everything isn't nicely wrapped up and tied with a neat bow on top of it. And, kind of uglier endings, that still are satisfying somehow. But, the format of the medium allows you to do that kind of stuff and not alienate people necessarily. Which I think is a net positive, even though, sometimes that's going to rub some people the wrong way.
And as far as trying those more unusual things, it still helps if your endings are telling different sides of the same story rather than just some things you go into one ending and it feels like you're in a completely different visual novel. It's like so bizarrely different than everything else. It's not even the same story. It just happens to have, two of the characters or something.
Yeah, that's one of the pitfalls of the fact that a lot of VNs for production time reasons have multiple authors, and you'll have somebody like Rewrite is a great example of how different some of the character routes can be, because you've got 3 different authors writing those character routes,
and even
so.
Sorry, continue.
Like, even though they have set like, hey, this is what we have laid down already. This is how everything works. They kind of all jump from that point and do their own thing sometimes. So it can feel very different in each route.
And with Rewrite specifically, even some of the routes written by the same person feel very different.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So since I brought up something in particular here, let's move on a little bit here to the next thing we wanted to talk about. Anything notably exceptional or terrible that you've seen as far as endings in visual novels? Don't everyone jump at once.
Trying to think how to phrase this. I have an interesting example. Let's start with Rewrite because you brought Rewrite up.
Sure.
I think that's definitely one that suffers from the multiple author issue, but at the same time, like, personally, I feel like they did a much better job with most of the character routes than they did with the actual true ending, which is kind of weird because normally you'd expect the true ending to be the, like, better actual end, but for whatever reason, it just did not click with me in the same way that a lot of the character endings did.
I would agree with that. I think, not every character ending landed for me. I think the true ending completely was a miss, and so it's one of those bizarre things where it was different. You were seeing very much so different pieces of the same story, so it wasn't those. Even though they felt radically different, it wasn't the case of like these are completely different stories. They were definitely telling you things about the universe, and they were interconnecting. You were getting information in one that could lead to the other, and then what they all built up towards in the true ending just felt so lackluster and a lot of like. To me, there was a lot of plot holes. Some people would argue that, but it felt like they didn't quite all come together and tie everything up the way it really should have.
Yeah, and that's something that I know I said, they were radically different, each character route, but it was purposeful for Rewrite in particular. It wasn't actually that out there, but if you're looking at just them, you might be like, oh, why is this the way it is? It could kind of throw you off a little bit that they're that way.
The only one that felt really out of place and not necessarily purposeful, it could have been purposeful, was to me Chihaya's route. That one felt tonally very off. It was like a shonen battle almost compared to all the others.
Yeah.
And that was actually exactly what I was alluding to, with even 2 routes by the same author can be radically different, because that one was just so bizarre.
I thought that was the case, yeah. Ange, do you want to rush to the defense of Rewrite?
Well, I mean, I'll admit that the true ending itself could have been better, because it was just unfortunate, because I actually thought the true route up to the ending was actually really good, possibly one of my favorite parts. But yeah, I do agree that particular part it's kind of weird, like how it turned out, and obviously I'm not going to name any details about it, but especially after it seemed like there was just a lot of build up, but then like it just kind of turned into whatever that was.
I'll say I liked what it was doing, but ultimately wasn't satisfied.
Yeah.
There is a trope, a very specific trope they use, and I've seen a lot of works use this, and it's rarely done well, unfortunately. And it was a trope they built up to in the route that leads into the true route. And they built up to this very specific trope. I'm going to dance around what that trope is. And then the execution of it needs to be perfect. And they did not convince me that the events played out the way that fit that trope, if you understand what I'm saying. People who've read Rewrite probably understand.
Yeah, I feel you.
Dodging the spoilers
Dodging
very
the
delicately. Yeah.
Well,
That would have been an easier trope to talk about if we weren't talking about a specific visual novel.
Yeah, right. Sorry, I ruined it
Just
by bringing
bring it up
Rewrite
later and pretend you're not talking about Rewrite, and then hopefully no one will notice.
That's how.
You just gave it away
Problem
now.
solved.
I was already considering doing that.
I feel like there's actually kind of an amusingly similar example for Rewrite too. There's a VN that I have kind of almost the exact same problem with, which is where all of like the character routes and the endings and the true route is like really solid, and then the actual ending of the VN is just like it feels like sometimes I think authors get a certain like artistic vision of what they want, and then they write backwards from there, and you don't necessarily get to that vision. Like you already had it, so you leave it there, but the things you built up don't actually like conclude with the conclusion you want, and you leave it in anyway, and you have this mismatch. And I really feel like much like Rewrite, is basically the exact same thing. Or if you just chop like the last 5 minutes off of the VN is improved like by a massive amount.
I feel like that could be a problem with a lot of stories. Not even VNs in general. You have an end goal that you're like, this is where I want to reach. And then you do all this stuff and you're building up to it, or you think you're building up to it, but maybe your audience doesn't realize you're building up to it, or they think you are and you just don't, But then when you finally get to it, you're like, oh no, I didn't build this up right, but I'm out of time, so well. And I feel like maybe sometimes that happens, that you have for anything, you have an end goal that you're aiming for, and then just maybe it's not prepared as much because the entire time what not be as in you the person not the visual novel, but like the author knows what they're trying to go towards, but maybe hasn't conveyed that very well to the person experiencing.
I feel like that's a little bit less, acceptable in visual novels though, because a lot of other works you're releasing chapter by chapter, episode by episode. By and large, visual novels are released in one go. So you've got your editor and all these different people who could tell you from start to finish, you didn't build this up right. There are, of course, exceptions. There are some episodic visual novels and stuff like that. There are sequels, trilogies, all sorts of stuff like that. But by and large, you're telling the whole story and releasing it in one go. So you can get that feedback and adjust the entire thing. And so it's a lot less of, well, it's too late to fix it, unless you're working to a really strict deadline, which I know does happen.
Yeah, and I think that might be happening more and more these days for at least the Japanese side of things, where they're some companies, the scene isn't as robust as it was in Japan a while, years ago. So they're against some rather hard deadlines sometimes. So I don't know. I haven't seen much word of anything that really flopped expectation wise lately, but it's a concern that could happen with things coming out today.
I think that's especially apparent in something like the Zero Escape series, where
I was just about to bring that up too.
My biggest complaint with Virtue's Last Reward, which is phenomenal and actually makes really good use of all of the things we've been talking with endings before this, but of course it was intended to be not the last game, and so it ends with a sequel hook, but then the sequel was put on hold and almost didn't come out, which would have left it like with this awful really inconclusive ending, because it expects to lead directly into the next game, which is kind of a risky thing to do, and so you have this case where he obviously wanted to tell a longer story, I guess, but because he was releasing it episodically, basically, like that was almost very, very bad.
Yeah, very large episodes, but episodically.
The Zero Escape series is a very interesting one to talk about because it runs the full gamut of the good and the bad of multiple endings in visual novels. VLR and to a lesser extent 999 both utilize that, telling different aspects of the story and making the multiple endings part of the structure very well. Zero Time Dilemma, a little bit less so. There's a lot of funky things going on in there. And then, as you mentioned, there's that sequel hook at the end of VLR, which is actually 100% dropped, or at least not the entire thing. The stinger part of it.
They dropped parts of it, yeah.
They dropped the stinger, which is the very last thing you're left with as your hook. The very, very last thing, and then it's not in.
That sounds awful.
It is not in it at all.
It was a really cool idea, and they just never brought it up ever again.
Obviously, it was a setup for the fourth game that hasn't come out yet.
Of course. And
obviously.
We haven't really touched on it too much yet, but the series also features a number of very well done bad ends. Bad ends that tell you stuff, bad ends that still build on the story. And in fact, I would say in some of them, the majority of the ends are bad ends, but those bad ends give you information which you can directly apply to your decisions in other routes, which is a very interesting way to do things.
That is something I really like in visual novels that feature bad endings, is when the bad ending isn't there just to be like, oh, this was the wrong decision, we're going to show you what happens when you screwed up. It actually can tell you something. Bad endings that have some kind of story or some kind of additional information that you can use to inform other things you do. More than just looking back and being like, oh, that's how I screwed up. I should go back actually 3 choices and fix this thing so that my affection with whoever is high enough so that they don't kill me.
Fate's actually a pretty bad offender for that. It's like, oh, you picked the stairs instead of the hallway. Fuck you. That's a bad ending because reasons.
It goes both ways on that. Yeah, it's got a couple really good ones, but then it's also got some that's like, okay, well, I picked this choice because I know I'm gonna die and I'm a completionist, so let's go.
And for some games like Fate, you can make a distinction between a bad end and a dead end. A dead end where you just... But unfortunately in Fate, some of the dead ends are like 30 minutes of playing the game as if it's completely normal. Yeah. And then you get your dead end.
That's you can set up a decision at some point and find out that down the line I messed up there, which means I have to skip through all this content instead of just going back one choice.
I think Heaven's Feel has one that's like the choice you make and the actual ending are like 2 or 3 days of in-game time apart, and it's like a lot.
Yes, I think
One of the things that's tricky with Fate in particular is that a lot of people find the choices that lead to bad ends counterintuitive because they're not based on normal logic. They're based on the logic of the main character, which is an interesting concept.
Yeah.
But there is nothing in the game that really indicates that to you. Like, I think if like there was a tutorial that said like try to stay in character as much as possible to not get bad ends.
I think as you play Fate Stay Night, you quickly realize that you need to get inside of Shiro's head for some of your decisions. I sure did, because at some point I was like, this is the choice I would normally take, which is why it's going to kill me. Because I do not think like Shiro thinks.
And I did as well, but I know I've heard other people complaining about it who never did, and they just couldn't figure out why they were getting all these terrible endings.
I guess going to a visual novel where I pretty much like the major ending, like almost I just really liked it as a whole, was a Swan Song. It's not like it's a decently popular visual novel, but basically to just give some context, it's the visual novel's kinetic linear, and it's kind of a overall pretty depressing, I guess maybe bittersweet kind of visual novel as a whole, because it has like this whole thing where it's a survival visual novel where after an earthquake during Christmas, like everyone's just trying to survive in this harsh snow, and just not to give too many details, like the major ending is very much keeps with the tone of like the whole visual novel, and kind of has a whole, like the way it was, the events were leading up to it, like made perfect sense, and the way it went out just kind of, you can really it just, you felt really emotional like by the end. But it also has this interesting case where there's a second ending that's like the complete opposite tone wise of the whole visual novel, so it kind of felt like it was just added in because they're like, oh no, this ending that's probably supposed to be the true ending was maybe too depressing for people to read, so we're just going to add this other one, so if people want to feel better, they can read this one if they really want to find it. But I think that one can only be unlocked after the major ending. So I think it's for that visual novel, it's probably better to just read the first ending you get. And this isn't excluding any bad endings, because there's a whole bunch of those. But I'm just talking about the major ending you get at the end.
I think something that kind of comes to mind in mentioning that, a good example of an ending is, I think Sayano Uta does a really good job. There's only a couple there, but they're all tone-wise. They kind of touch on different aspects of the story.
Yeah.
It's like there's 3 endings, and each one kind of focuses on a different aspect of the tone. And I think they're all like one of them is clearly intended to be like the canonical ending, and I think that one is the best one. But the other ones, they don't also feel out of place. They feel like they're focusing on like a different way the story could have gone, and still really fit in with the tone, which I think is definitely impressive, especially because kind of like more like a swan song like Sayano Uta is a bit dark, and so to have like a satisfying ending that fits tonally.
A little dark. Maybe touch.
Just tiny bit. But they do a good job with that. Like they don't feel like you're just being depressed for no reason. Like it feels like the endings are satisfying despite the bleak tone.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you there about Sayano Uta. It's one of my favorites because I feel like it's so well put together, and that includes the endings that it has. Like they all feel appropriate to be in there, and they all flesh out the entire story in their own way. And I think that's one of the better things you can do with various endings in
another visual novel that comes to mind. I'm not going to actually say the name of it, so
sure.
But with both the Swan Song and the Sayano Uta, what you're talking about, different tones for the endings, and some ending being maybe intended versus not intended. There's a visual novel out there where there's a single choice to make the ending, and you guys well know what I'm talking about once I say it. And it's basically a check over, whether or not you either have noticed and picked up on or agree with the major themes of this visual novel. And, you get the more canon ending if you do, agree with those themes, and you get a very tonally different but still substantial and rather interesting ending that tells you a lot about characters and about, what happens when you believe the opposite of those themes if you pick the other. And it's a little controversial among some members of the community, but I think a lot of people really enjoy both of them, and they jokingly make fun of people who pick the wrong one first.
I think I know which one that is, but I won't say.
I mean, you can pick the wrong one first because you know it's the wrong one.
That's what I did, actually.
Yeah.
Something actually I think might be worth mentioning. I'm not sure if this is getting a little too far into. I'll also avoid mentioning the name of the VN. But I've seen there's one VN that I actually quite liked a lot, where what they did was the like final true ending you got after you'd seen every other ending actually kind of like recontextualize and put a totally new spin on the whole VN in a way that I think a lot of people have found very controversial, and I definitely did when I first started. And it was interesting because it felt like the author wanted to take a very different kind of risk and kind of threw this on as an extra little capstone. It's only about, I think, like maybe 5 minutes long, but it like totally recontextualizes everything in a way that kind of makes you think. And I think that was like, that's a definite risk you can take with these, because it's effectively him saying everything you've read so far is, now going to look totally different based on this one little 5-minute window I gave you right at the very end. But I think if you have that kind of like vision, like we were saying with the multiple endings, I guess I'll concede more of that point to see Tom about, like if, let's say you really hate this ending, well, the other ones are all quite excellent. And so you always feel like, well, this is my canonical ending.
Yeah, something to kind of build on that. And again, I'm not going to mention any names here because there's a lot of things that do this. I've read several visual novels that do this, that what you learn at the end of the story in a way can recontextualize large parts of the previous sections of the visual novel. You can suddenly look and be like, oh, that's what was happening this whole time. Or, oh, I never realized that. It gives you some new lens you can look at the earlier content, which for some visual novels adds replay value to. Because you suddenly have this new thing. You're like, oh, well, if this has been going on this whole time, or this was actually what this person thought or was doing or felt, that's why all this other stuff, I should reread that and see. And it can really give a visual novel a lot more staying power and just make it that more impressive in hindsight if it's something that does that.
Yeah, I can think of a lot of works that do that well, and I can think of a few that do it poorly, because one of the things risk you run into is when you recontextualize things like that, you need to make sure everything is consistent with everything that came before, and sometimes you can tell a twist was added kind of late because there are certain details that no longer quite work with that twist. And there's also like two different almost schools of thought on doing that. There's the ones that use their side routes to add contextualization, and then it all comes together in the true end. And then some use the true end to contextualize everything that came before it, including the side routes. Some do both, but I find that more often than not, it's one or the other.
And the thing is, you kind of have to, you can't cash everything in on your ending. You can't, rely on that to be... Yeah. For example, I'm never rereading Muffle of Extra because that VN is not very good, even if that when you finish the whole series, sure, there's a new context you can look at all the events in, but, holy shit, that is... I suffered through it because I heard, alternative was supposed to be good. And, yeah, sure, you can you've done something cool. You can go to hell. Listen, for some weird people out there who like Extra, sure, I'm sure that you should go reread it after finishing Alternative if you haven't already, because lots of new content.
I will someday.
Yeah, I don't want to, even though I know it's supposed to be more palatable the second time, because you can't just rely on the ending to make me want to read 8 hours of garbage.
As someone who has yet to read Muv-Love Alternative because I'm daunted by the idea of reading through the previous two works, I'm gonna tentatively agree with that. Where I've heard
it's not as bad as I'm making it out to be, but
my tolerance for that type of stuff is pretty low.
There's one more visual novel that I thought had a particularly really interesting way that ending is executed because it was more on a meta sense. It's I think people might know if they read it, but it's an ending in a pretty linear visual novel where in order to get the ending, you have to take action outside the visual novel itself to reach the ending. And I thought, even though I wasn't I thought the visual novel as a whole was okay before that, I thought that part of the visual novel where you had to take extra action outside the visual novel to get the ending was really interesting, and I thought that stood out.
The classic, Metal Gear Solid, the
frequency to call them is on the back of the box.
Yeah,
those things can be a lot of fun. I like them more when they're well integrated, which I love them in Metal Gear Solid. That was because my first time really encountering them. But since then, I kind of if they make sense in the context, they're great. If they just feel like they're forced in to have something unique, I'm not so much a fan. As far as other works where the ending can't save, endings won't completely destroy a work that was great up until that point, and they won't save a work that was, mediocre up until that point. And some people might disagree with this, but Inganok, for me, was very much so. I love the beginning, I love the ending, but the middle is just a slog, and the ending is great, but it can't save all the repetition that I went through. Literal, paragraphs where only single words have been substituted out for large sections of the text. And so as much as endings are very important, I don't think they're the end-all be-all of a work.
Yeah, no, I can agree with that to an extent. 'Cause I've had some experiences pretty well marred by an ending that I didn't enjoy. And I can look back and think, yeah, I liked getting up, working towards this ending. I liked the journey towards it, but then I got to the ending. I was and I'm never going to recommend somebody to read this.
I think for me,
even though I had a good experience all the way up to the ending.
I think for me, if it's just a poorly executed ending, I can live with it. But if it's one of those recontextualizing that we're talking about, and it does that in a way that ruins the rest of the work for me. Like, in retrospect, the rest of the work is made worse by this context that was given by the ending. That will ruin it.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct on that one.
But if it's
That's
just
the risk.
if it's just like it failed to have a good climax, or it kind of petered out, or it was mediocre,
or rushed or whatever,
it certainly diminishes the work for me, but it doesn't completely negate everything that came before it.
So before we get away from talking about endings and get to the end of our talk here, I want to talk a little bit about what kind of endings would we like to see more of in visual novels. What kinds of things that you think are particularly good or unique? They don't show up as often that maybe we should see or would like to see more of.
Personally, I kind of want to see more bittersweet endings, but that like actually, fit with the tone of the visual novel. Like, I don't want to just like have a mostly, happy-go-lucky the end, and suddenly like some shit happens, and then like suddenly like he has to part with the heroine or whatever. But I kind of something that like where an event can happen in the middle of a route or something, and it leads to like a bittersweet ending, and it makes sense. And I just think, I'm all for happy endings and such, but more bittersweet endings that make sense are pretty interesting to me.
What I'd like to see more of is more endings, and to this extends to routes that aren't heroine focused, that aren't just like, this is the character, this is their ending. That endings that each tell a different aspect of the story, but not through the lens of these like one couple that like tell either a different side of a conflict or different parts of a theme that really tie together in an interesting way that you can't necessarily get when you're tied to limiting things to these two characters, are dating now, which is a lot of what the visual novels tend to gravitate towards.
And there's a little bit, sometimes you'll get some things that this is technically this person's route, but even in that case, it's not the focus. Like the romance that might occur in the route isn't actually the focus. Something about something about drawing something about drawing the connection with that character either brings about a certain turn of events or whatever it is, but it's not actually the focus that there's this romance going on. It's about these actions that are happening. I do find, though, that more often than not, when the romance isn't the focus, it also feels like it's just tacked on to make it the heroine route. I've felt that way about a couple of things. Even the ends that I've really liked, I felt that way about a couple of them, where it's okay, sure. I mentioned several casts ago the visual novel Umineko the Ethereal, and how I felt that the different routes really came about because I pursued one of the three different heroines. Like, that actually shaped it in a way. And there was one of those where the romance was just kind of like, oh yeah, by the way, they like each other at the very end. Let's have some sex and get out of here.
Is that like your go-to pickup line?
Huh?
Oh, I was just...
Yeah, it is. I know. I mean, don't you do that? You always walk up to people in bars and be like, hey, let's have some sex and get out of here. You should probably do that in the other order, really.
You might want to rework that.
Yeah, I'm going to take that one back to the drawing board.
Anyway, I think I get where both you're coming from. It seems like the common thread here is like, less about the heroine, more about the story, and like, who could have possibly guessed that putting more of an emphasis on the story itself would generally lead to a more enjoyable experience. Assuming you're not just reading for the heroine, but I think that's something that's hard to get away from in the medium. But I'm definitely the kind of person who is not reading for the specific heroine, reading for the plot, and I totally agree. And I think like Steins Gate kind of does this a little bit. It's good sometimes and bad other times, where like the route exists because of something happening with the heroine, but it's not always. Like, a few of the alternate endings in Steins Gate are like, you got it because it's a romance thing, and so you have that heroine, but a few others are just like the romance is just kind of a part of the actual story rather than like the focus. And again, I think that the ones like one of the endings, I think it's Amane's, is like better because it's not so much about her as it is about like a scenario in which like she ends up being the main heroine, as opposed to just like, oh, this is, such and such heroine route.
Yeah.
Yep. I can only think of one Steins Gate route that I felt really was just like too much, just purely about the heroine.
As far as other things that I'd like to see more of in endings, I mean, I'm always a fan of like really tying things together across a lot of routes, especially when it's like mechanically intended to be part of that. Like if you're gonna have, I think I tend to prefer like things that have a true ending rather than multiple parallel ends, just because I think it's easier to tell the stories you tell with that kind of format I tend to like more for the kind of coherent plotline, and I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to really drive home a single point by using multiple branches, and more of that like a VLR or a 999. I should really just read more Ichikoshi, as I think the thing I'm getting to here.
Go read some Punchline.
Oh God,
I haven't actually read that one.
He's working on another one, so there'll be more.
I agree with you, Relina. I definitely want to see more of that, but it has to be well executed, because when it's poorly executed, that leads to some of the things that we were describing as the worst endings we've seen in visual novels. Where,
it's a tricky thing to do right, but when it's done right, it's really excellent.
And I think a lot of the visual novels that do that type of thing like to make it a big twist, and I don't think it always needs to be a twist. I'd like to see one where from very early on you realize that's what's going on, because I don't think I've seen that done. Probably the Zero Escape games are the closest, but that's because like the second one you already know what's happened in the first one.
I can think of some things that you could figure out early on. Like there's enough, like there's some stories that they're building up to a certain twist, and there's hints towards a twist, but they're so obscure when you're reading it the first time that you'd have to be some kind of savant to find them before you actually got the reveal.
Sorry, I did that in Zero Time Dilemma. I was a crazy person. There's an entire channel on Discord of me just being an insane person because I figured out a twist like well before it happened. It's like, that's a strange detail.
A casual reader who is maybe putting a little bit of thought into it wouldn't probably reach this conclusion, because there's just not enough to do it, like to get more than, I don't know, what kind of goal do you think you have when you have like, here's the major twist, how many people do I want to be able to pick up on it before it happens? I feel like there's some kind of like number in the back of people's heads who write things that are twisty, that they want some quantity of reader to pick up on before it's revealed.
But like I was saying, it would be really nice to see one where it's like, it's not even just that it's a twist that people can pick up on, but is actually like, this is the premise right out the gate. We're being forthright about it, and from the start it's going to be these interconnected things, because there's probably a lot of stuff you can do with that that really hasn't been explored.
I think I might know an example, but I need to actually read it first before I can say if it is or not. I'll get back to you in several months on that.
Is it English translated?
No.
It doesn't matter to me then.
Yeah. It's not impossible that it would be, but we'll see.
I think actually kind of does that, but then again it kind of just falls apart because it's like, actually, oops, never mind. That true route is totally unrelated. It was good still until the ending, but like they definitely tried that, like with the premises like the time travel multiple timeline stuff right out the gate. Like there's like, this is like step one, this is how this is gonna be, and then it kind of takes a very different turn. I was like, I would have been okay if you just stuck with the first thing the whole time. That would have been fine.
Okay, and with that, we'll move ahead a little here and talk about news that's happened since the last time we put one of these out, which, if for those of you keeping track at home, has been a while, so there's a bit. The first thing we want to talk about is something that all of us, I don't know how everyone else feels about it, but all of us are somewhat engaged with, is the Umineko Gold Kickstarter that started up a while back and then just kind of stopped. Got delayed, and then
this whole Kickstarter has been a very bizarre experience, because it came out of nowhere. No one knew what was going on, but they claimed to have all these legitimate connections. And as far as I know, no one has disproved that they have them. They definitely have a connection to Manga Gamer. But they were very active on Twitter and other social media. And then someone on their team, which turned out to be the lead person who was communicating, had a health problem. They went dark for like a month, 2 months maybe. And then, they said they're back. They're just going to shore everything up. So if they have another health issue, it won't all fall apart. And then they cut communication almost entirely. They've maybe said like 2 tweets since then.
They tweeted about Valentine's Day, and that's all I can see recently.
Yeah, I haven't actually been following it. I was basically just relying on other people's reactions to it to get my news about it, because personally, some of the aspects of the project, I was like, why? Yeah, it's been really puzzling, like seeing it. Like, I get health problems and all that, but I wish it'd be a little more communicated what's going on, because a lot of people are curious about it, I'm sure.
And part of it is that they keep talking about connections directly with Ryukishi. Apparently, he's going to be providing some original content for it. And part of the theories about why they're so in the dark is because there's still negotiations going on about that, and they can't mention anything. But that could entirely not be true. This could all have been some kind of elaborate hoax. It's not likely, but the longer they go without communication, the more the community thinks that.
Yeah, the more doubt there is around the integrity of the project.
And for those who aren't familiar, it's a project largely to do English dubbing on Umineko, the visual novel. There's some other aspects to it, but that's like the core component. And a lot of the community who's already read it is excited for it, either because it'll get more people involved who like dubs, or just because they've promised merch as part of the Kickstarter, and getting Umineko merch in America is impossible.
They're also going to have the graphics from the PS3 version, so you don't have to patch it in. But I mean, most people patch it in anyway.
Yeah, that's what they said. I don't know. Well, you see, I'm curious about that, because I think there is potential for an Umineko Switch port to happen.
Oh.
And I don't. And this is my own thoughts. I don't think there's been an actual affirmation of that, but since there was a Higurashi one, there was a Higurashi port to Switch, I feel like there'd probably be one for Umineko, and I bet they would go for getting those assets. So I wonder,
One of the things is, when the website for it initially went up, it was very unclear whether those graphics were going to be part of it, and that was later added. So that might have been part of the delaying process of securing those rights from, I forget who owns them now, because Alchemist went under.
It's the rights for all of the assets that were used in the PS3 version of Umineko are just everywhere. It's a nightmare.
I've heard,
I don't know.
Last I heard, they weren't going to be adding the Japanese voice acting. That would still have to be patched in, because from what I've heard from sources in Witch Hunt, or in Manga Gamer, I can't remember actually which at this point, was that they would have to negotiate individually with each voice actor's agent to get. That is what I heard too.
Wow, is that the rights to those recordings went back to the voice actors themselves?
Wow.
For whatever reason, I don't know the legal things that happened behind it. I don't even know if that's true. So don't take that news here as like
proof,
the reality of the situation. But that's what I've heard. And even if that's not the case, it's something complicated and obnoxious to deal with like that. So,
but as far as the graphical assets, I believe they're all owned by one company, and I knew the company at one point. I can't remember who it is anymore.
Okay. Cool. Well, moving on the Umineko related news, we've got some time ago we had the openings and previews shown for not only Umineko Saku but also for When They Cry 5, which a lot of people are very excited about. People who have read Higurashi Umineko or anything else that Ryukishio 7 wrote, really excited for the next thing that he's putting out, especially if it's another When They Cry.
So When They Cry 5 is very interesting because it's going in a very different direction, at least seemingly. He can be very misleading with some of his initial promo material, but the official title is Coconia no Nako Koroni. Coconia is Latin for stork. Umineko's Japanese for seagull, obviously Higurashi for cicada. So interesting that they went with Latin. Interesting that it's a bird again, but it's going to be like some kind of urban battle royale steampunk thing, it looks like. And they introduced like this large cast of factions. And supposedly there's going to be a lot less emphasis on mystery, but I would doubt there will be none. There will probably still be things for us to puzzle out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you never know what it's going to be. It could just be, this is what I want you to think. And once you get going, you'll realize that there's something cooking that you got to put some thought into.
One of the things that will be interesting is, so far there's only 2 titles in the When They Cry series. 1 and 2 is Higurashi, 2 and 3 is Umineko. So people consider the commonalities between those to be what defines it as a franchise. But with this new entry, we'll see, what does Ryukishi think makes it a franchise? Because now we'll have a third thing, and it'll be what's common between all 3 of them.
Yeah.
The more works you add to a series, the more clear that becomes. And so it'll be really interesting from that perspective.
Do we have any kind of estimated release? I know at some point she said something about like, it'll probably be about X amount of time. He's like, actually, I can't write as fast as I used to.
I can't.
It's going to be longer.
I can't remember precisely, but I thought this summer's Comiket was supposed to be part 1. I could be wrong about that.
Maybe that. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. That might have been the initial thought, and then he changed his mind.
Witch Hunt has officially denied that they're going to be already having the translation ready for simul release, but there's some rumblings that maybe that still might be happening. I don't know, but at the very least, they've confirmed they will be working on it, and it will be their priority.
Yeah, I don't think there was. I feel like there was not any doubt as soon as we knew that the project existed that Witch Hunt would get on board, because they've had a working relationship with Ryukusha 7 for a long time now.
I mean, they provided subtitles for the trailer, which was simul released. Yeah, and we're credited directly in that. So
yeah, exactly. So that'll be exciting for a number of people.
And we still don't know anything about Umineko Saku, like what it could be about.
There's very little we know about what it's going to be, in relation to what it was left to explore in Umineko. There is some interesting details. They show 2 new characters in the trailer. One appears to be some unused character designs from Trianthology, so people recognize it from that. The other one is actually from a very obscure piece of Umineko literature known as Our Confession, which is a tip that he passed out at some Comiket. And so that character, there's like a drawing of it in the book that was part of, which is Floros, which is a demon. And so, I immediately recognized that character because I'm a huge Umineko nerd.
Because you're C-Tom, yeah.
Because I'm C-Tom, the huge Umineko nerd. So it's possible Our Confession takes the form of another episode of Umineko that you get to see a bit behind the scenes on. And so one theory is that it will be that episode, but in a complete form. It could very well have nothing to do with that episode. Maybe he just really wanted to use that character design.
Yeah. Interesting. All right, well, moving on. We could probably end up talking about Umineko stuff all day if we wanted to, but we don't. I don't want to, at least, just because
you do have the right cast for that.
Yeah, it's true. Moving on to some localization news. We had was this? My sense of time is so screwed up sometimes. This "If you love me, then say so" infamously used "dude" in place of Oni-chan. Which I saw a lot of people up in arms about in the VN's Discord. How long ago was that now? Was that like a month ago or something?
I think it was more than a few months ago because...
Yeah, it's been a little while now because I remember that. I saw people posting images of it with saying dude, and I was like...
Yeah, the news is ordered in the order that it came out, besides the release of the but
so it's been a while.
It's been a while, but it's just still kind of a funny thing that happened.
Yeah. Some other things about some acquisitions we had from Nekonyan. They've got Senran Banka now, which Sekai used to have, and they also have Making Lovers. Some kind of bad news for people who follow the Japanese scene or just are excited about this particular VN in general. Sprite, the makers of Aokana, are halting operations at the end of March. That's pretty sad news because Aokana is one of those that people have been wanting. We had that whole, long drawn out fan TL things with problems happening there that people been wanting for it to come out in English for a long time, which was probably boosted by the fact it got an anime too. But yeah, that's kind of sad news, seeing companies shut down. More on that later.
Yeah.
I'll just mention it now. Another company saying they are closing down operations is Minori, who have produced some of the highest production value visual novels in the scene, are closing down because they're just not. They feel like what they want to create don't align with what the consumers want right now, and that's really sad to see. Let's see, moving on here. Sekai Project has another site where they are posting their updates on their projects. The Grisaya trilogy was almost released uncensored on Manga Gamer. I don't recall that.
There was this thing where, like, I guess there were assets where that they had the lewd CGs where there's like no censorship, but then like Manga Gamer released it, and then they realized, like, they were like advertising it that was going to be uncensored, but then after it released, it was just the whatever versions on Denpasoft, and then Manga was like, "Oh no, we're sorry, we didn't know this. We'll give you refunds if you actually bought this because you wanted this version." Mm-hmm. Like, wow, that's cool.
I do appreciate whenever Manga Gamer does an oops kind of thing like that. They're immediately like, "Oh, we're gonna make it right. I'm sorry, guys. Jeez."
Yeah, and it's pure speculation whether it was just a mistake in the advertising or whether it was something that was pulled away from what they had at the last minute.
Yeah, you never know. More fun news about Steam. Steam seems to, I don't know what's going on.
I don't think they know what's going on
lately. I don't think they do. It feels sometimes like there's like 4 people and they all act independently. And they keep doing things. This most recent thing is they've pulled down more visual novels for content. One of the big ones, and it's a real problem that it came down, is Kara no Shoujo 2.
Which is also weird because Kara no Shoujo is still there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think part of it is this whole larger thing going on. You see it all over Reddit where people are being banned for things or things are being pulled down related to, I believe it's some legislation that the U.S. passed recently that is ill-defined, and people are paranoid that they're going to run foul of it, and so they're doing all sorts of crazy things they don't necessarily need to do to try to avoid lawsuits.
Just to watch, just to cover themselves. Yeah, it is what it is. Moving right along, we have kind of more recently, Iro Toridori no Sekai just made its Kickstarter goal. It had stretch goals for the sequels, and we didn't hit those, but they are still promised to come out. And that was a Soul Press release, right?
Correct.
Okay, that's what I thought. And speaking about Soul Press, they're also starting to put out some releases on the Jest store. This one is kind of exciting to me, even though I probably not going to get around to it for a long time. If I do it all, the Muv-Luv Photon Flowers beta has been released for backers. I am a backer of that, as I think... Did we all back that Kickstarter? T-Tom, did you?
I did, but I still haven't gotten around to reading.
I backed it for $1 just to keep up on the updates.
I backed it for a lot more than $1.
I backed it at the tier that got me the full trilogy.
I was either going to do $1 or like enough to get the physical stuff, and I was like,
I have the physical. I have some physical stuff in my room, so yeah. That's what it is.
Do anyone know what Photon Flowers is going to be like? Because I haven't really looked into it.
Photon Flowers has got like some after story stuff. The big thing that it's got is some building off of the ending of Muv-Luv Extra endings. There's a large kind of exploration past Takeru and Sumika's ending. And there's some other small things in there too. I think there's a little bit of everyone's... continuing off of everyone's route. I don't recall. I'd have to look it up. I meant to do that before, so I could say what it is. But it's all kind of more after story content, and then some supplemental stuff.
Okay.
Let's see. Moving right along, we've got a lot of things that have released. We have Kindred Spirits, Full Chorus, Interview by Umesoft and Trinoline. Those were Manga Gamer releases. We had Sekai release 9-9, which if you are calling it in Japanese, you'd say something different, but I bet you would call it 9-9 if you are an English speaker.
But not
episode
999.
1. Yeah, not 999, but just 99. That's 9-9 spelled out. That does have an episode 2 in Japanese that I'm assuming is going to get localized. I believe it's supposed to have more than just 2. I think it's supposed to have at least 3. I've heard great things about that one, just incidentally.
Okay.
Soul Press put out Sakura Sakura and Under One Wing. Nekonyan has put out Hello Goodbye and the Fureraba fan disc. And some other things that have come out. The full voice patch for Tsubahime, that has not made its way into English, right? That's just still a Japanese thing. Or did somebody patch that into?
I don't know. That's just what I saw.
Yeah, I don't think that made its way
Okay.
into English, but that does
Okay.
exist. There's a full voice patch for Tsubahime that voices all of the characters, except I want to say there was still like a random side character somewhere that didn't get a voice still. I don't remember. We have Konosora Flight Diary, The Dearest Ire,
Interview with Bay.
Interview at Kazumi Bay. Recently, the Fate Stay Night Real Tenua Ultimate Edition fan patch came out, which is now supposed to be, of course, being called the Ultimate Edition, the best way to read Fate Stay Night, which is exciting. I always like more reason to tell people to read Fate Stay Night. We, of course, have Steins Gate Elite, which a lot of people, myself included, think is kind of superfluous.
I've heard linear bounded Phonogram is good though, but I have not played
I have heard that too.
because
yes. I
on
have
Steam
heard
you
that's
have
great.
to buy Elite to get
Yeah.
bounded Phonogram.
Yeah. Anyone who doesn't know what Steins Gate Elite is, Elite takes some of the scenes from the anime, right, and animates that instead of uses the scenes from the anime instead of the content that was in the original visual novel.
I think there's some new animation
There
too.
might be-
but
there
the point
probably
is
has
that
to
it's a
be,
fully like animated version of Steins
Yeah.
Gate.
Yeah, which to me, I thought the artwork, the art in general in the anime didn't have as much charm as the visual novel art does.
Agreed.
I think if you're going to be reading it, like anime's advantage was that it was paced because it's an anime, whereas visual novel you read at your own pace. That's the advantage of the anime. So just taking the anime animation and doing away with the visual novel art is not the right decision.
Yeah. So that was kind of a thing. But then we had very recently the surprise Daitoshikan release, which no one saw coming. And that was, as of recording, that was only a couple days ago, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, I literally just added in last minute,
yeah.
and it was because I could have, as far as I know, it was like one of those fan translations that was in limbo forever. Like apparently,
I read the post that the person said, and there's been no word on anything there's been no progress in like a year and a half. And they're just like, well, this is basically done. We're just not pulling the trigger, so here we go. And shoved it out so that way it's not just sitting with no one being able to read it when it's basically done. So I've seen some people complain a little bit about what it was, like how some things are translated or whatnot, but it's
every release.
It's going to happen with everything. So that's just the reality of releases and the audience. Any other news we didn't cover here that we want to slip in last minute? I don't think so. So with that'll wrap up our news. Our news will be maybe a little more focused on a single time period rather than such a broad span during our next episode, because hopefully that's going to be sooner than this current episode was in relation to the last one. So we'll be moving right along now to our Shill segment, where we're going to have our very own Ange time talk about one of his favorites.
Hello, everyone. This is Ange time. Today, I am here to show the visual novel Teardrops, developed by the company Overdrive, who also made visual novels like Kira Kira and Gogo Nippon. Teardrops is a light-hearted karage that focuses on a group of talented musicians that form a band, start from the bottom, and figure out what they need to do and what to avoid to become more successful. There's a decent amount of comedy, but it's not the focus. You get to see both individual character growth as well as the band members getting closer. Speaking of which, the main 5 members of the band are basically a group of misfits. They're really different. The main character, Shoichi, is very refined, quiet, but can be quite competitive. The main singer is super incredibly honest, blunt, and will do whatever she can to get her way. The main guitarist is friendly and down to earth, but is constantly noted by herself to be very plain. The man on bass is a bit of a cynic and rough around the edges, but is a likable guy underneath the surface. The one on drums is a bit of an airhead and tends to wander around to do whatever she wants. That said, they all share the same thing, a passion for music. The banter between the 5 makes for some good comedy and good serious scenes despite their differences, and you can see it in the scenes where they're just simply writing rock songs together. The main character's childhood friend, who's also one of the main heroines, is a nice, timid, but helpful character who also interacts with the main band members pretty often. One interesting thing about this VN is that a lot of it does not take place in high school. That's because the main character and his childhood friend are roughly college age. So that means a lot of this setting is going to be in a rock house that the childhood friend's father owns, and that's where the band practices. Also, the main token male sidekick character is actually a man in his 30s who's also the bass. Acts more like a mentor to the band instead of like the loser best friend who gets made fun of all the time. Since it's a band-themed VN, all the vocal songs are pretty solid as you'd expect, and there's also a pretty good variety of BGM. Like there's violin, piano-based songs, there's rock, guitar, bass songs, etc. Teardrops is actually a sequel to Kira Kira. It's not really needed to read Kira Kira first, but I would still recommend it because Kira Kira is a pretty good VN on its own, especially one particular route that pretty much everyone really likes. And there are a few cameos in Kira Kira that's shown up in Teardrops. And there is a fan just called D2B versus Teardrops, which is basically the two band groups from both VNs performing together, which is really cool. Overall, Teardrops is a very good, well-rounded visual novel that does many things well. The art is good, the music is good, the main characters are likable and have good interaction and development. The story of the band life is developed and described well, and overall, if you just want like a good fun time with some decent development and something unique with like the band thing, I highly recommend this visual novel.
And thank you, Ange, for telling us all about Teardrops. And with that, we will be wrapping up our episode here. I would like to thank C. Tom for joining us for this episode.
Thank you for having me. It was a blast.
Yeah, it was good. We'll have to do it again sometime, maybe. Anyway, next time we put out an episode, we are going to be talking about visual novel protagonists, kind of one of the most important aspects, and about how that shapes the experience and everything that entails. So until next time, I have been Nakanashi.
I'm Ange Time.
And I've been Rylan of Tricolor.
And we'll see you next time.